Angus Taylor is the Liberal member for Hume in New South Wales. Good morning, Angus.
Morning, Chris.
Now, the government has revealed its policy for the aged pension, complete with tables, comments, etc. Does this policy pass the fairness test in a way that last year's policy did not?
Well, I think it passes a whole lot of tests, Chris. We've got what's being proposed here is that something like 150,000 pensioners would get up to $30 a fortnight more than they're currently getting, on top of the significant increases they've been getting since we've been in government. And 90% of pensioners would be either better off or unchanged. And that includes something like 50,000 who are currently on part pension who will go to full pension. So I think this passes any test of good policy, and I'm delighted that we are moving in this direction. Of course, we do recognise that those who have a strong asset base and are currently getting what's generally a pretty modest part pension can get on with their lives without that part pension, and that is part of what we're proposing here, and we think that's a fair and reasonable way to drive these reforms.
So the government's clear up front. There'll be a lot of winners, but there will certainly be losers in this change in policy.
Yeah, but the truth is, if you've got a significant asset base and you've got your family home, and of course we're not proposing here that the family home be part of the test, then the truth is you have more than enough money to live on, and if by some happenstance your asset base does fall away, you will be eligible for the pension. So, no, I think this passes any test of good policy.
Now, the reason the government got into this area of pension reform in the last place in last year's budget is because the projections are that the cost of the aged pension is going to blow out in the coming decades. And the figures from last year was the changes in indexation might save something like $23 billion over the next 10 years. These changes, though, are not going to deliver anywhere near those sorts of savings, are they?
Oh, no, there will be significant savings. Look, the fundamental problem we've got here...
So sorry, what is that figure, say, over 10 years, do you know?
There will be savings coming from the change in the eligibility test, and I'm not going to anticipate what those numbers are. They will come out in the budget. But, I mean, the purpose of this exercise is to have a sustainable budget, a sustainable welfare and health spending, and we'll see that as the budget approaches and in the budget itself. And as I have said many times to you, the fundamental problem we're facing here is that spending is rising faster than income. And this, along with a whole series of other initiatives that need to be taken in aggregate, not each individual initiative, I think will position the budget to slow that growth in spending and maintain the growth in income, and perhaps even strengthen it a little. We'll talk about some of those areas of income that in a moment, I'm sure. But that's what we have to do, and this is part of a series of initiatives to achieve that, whilst making sure that we target our welfare and health spending to exactly the right people. And this is a very, very important part of what we will do in the budget and will continue to do in the coming years.
Well, let me ask you about that. I mean, the problem is the projected blowout in spending on pensions and retirement incomes. Does this policy in itself go far enough to address that issue, or what are the other areas that need to be touched on?
The problem's far broader than that. The problem is that our spending is rising at close to 4%, our structural spending. We've managed to keep it below that, but if you just let it go and didn't do anything, it's going at about 4%, and income is below 3%. That's the problem, and it's not just welfare, it's health, it's education. There's a whole series of areas that are driving this. And so, we have to look at the budget in aggregate. I'm not going to sort of look at each individual initiative and say, well, this is giving us enough or it's not. The question is whether we are getting our spending growth to a sustainable level, and that sustainable level ultimately has to be at or below, for a period of time at least, our income. And that's the job the government has, and it's the job we've been working on since...
I hear what you're saying in other areas such as health, whatever, but just on the area of pensions and the age pension in particular, does this policy really set the budget up, consolidate the budget in the long term, or are there more measures needed on that area?
The point I'm making, Chris, is no one initiative will set the budget up. The budget is measured at an aggregate level, and it should be assessed and evaluated at an aggregate level. Are we keeping our spending growth at or below our income growth? That's how we should measure the budget, and you can only measure that at an aggregate level. So it's pointless us talking about individual measures. What matters is the aggregate.
Okay. Now, the government's attention has been very much on the spending side of the budget, but it's now fairly clear that there will be some revenue measures. There's this idea of a so-called Netflix tax, essentially putting the GST on software, movies, whatever, downloaded from overseas. Does this make sense? Do you think will it raise significant money for the amount of money it costs to collect?
Well, as you know, I don't like raising any prospect of raising taxes, and I think Australians in general want lower taxes than they want governments to spend their money well. The reality is, though, that transactions are shifting. We're buying more and more, spending more and more of our money on what people call intangibles. That's things like movies and music and books from overseas. And to a significant extent, not universally, they've managed to avoid GST liability. You know, we talk a lot about wanting to tax the companies, but actually the very simple thing we're missing out on here, which is, I think, in many ways more important, is the GST. And I think it's very sensible to be talking about having GST on all services and goods that are sold in Australia within the categories that the GST applies to. That's just a very sensible thing to do, and that applies not just to services that are bought over your computer or your phone or your iPad, but it also applies to goods that are purchased online. And, you know, we are having, I think, a sensible debate about whether the threshold for goods purchased online, which is currently $1,000, should in fact be lower. You know, this is just good, sensible policy, but it has the ultimate objective has to be for lower taxes in Australia, not higher, and a broader base where we catch everything. Things aren't slipping through the net is a sensible way to make sure that we have lower taxes, not higher taxes.
Is it sensible now? It's probably likely that you can put the GST on those intangibles that you download on your computer, and you can do it fairly efficiently. But does it make sense to be trying to put the GST on an imported parcel that might cost $20? Because the fear there that it might actually cost more to monitor and impose that tax and the money collected.
Yeah, well, look, you know, Bill Shorten did a ridiculous piece of work that said you couldn't actually audit these parcels unless you are focused on things worth more than $1,000. I mean, no other country in the world that I know of, at least, has a threshold that high. Mostly they're much, much lower than that. I don't know how Bill Shorten came to that conclusion, and it was using pay rates that are ridiculous, I think, but you know, auditing techniques that are ridiculous. So, you know, this is something we have to have a good look at, and we have to make sure that we have a sensible threshold. And look, there's no shortage of retailers in Australia who are quick to tell you that having a threshold of $1,000 means that they struggle to compete with online overseas purchases. And, you know, that's pretty unfair on our small businesses that they have to pay GST, and yet someone purchasing online from overseas for something for $700 doesn't have to pay that GST. So this is a sensible discussion to have, but it all has to be with a broader objective of keeping our tax rates lower, not allowing them to go up. You know, and what worries me about this debate is that you're just putting more money into a black hole where government wastes that money, which is why the spending side of the equation is so critical to look at the same time.
Just finally, Angus Taylor, there's a move within Labor to be fair, it's not official Labor policy. There's a movement within Labor to have the major accounting firms and other consultancies disclose all meetings with government, with Treasury, with the tax office. I guess the implication there is that these consultancy firms are essentially working as de facto lobbyists. Does Labor have a point here, given the size and the influence of some of these firms?
Look, undue influence on public officials is a bad thing, but I'd make a couple of observations here. One is tying up our ministers in red tape and tying up the people that they work with in red tape rarely makes sense, and my observation of it is that it really actually delivers better outcomes. Second observation I make is the federal level is very different from state and local, where a lot of these issues have come up. And the reason it's so different is because state and local government focuses heavily on planning laws. And planning is where, for centuries, right since the initial land grants in Australia back at the beginning of the 19th century, it is a hotbed of corruption. As soon as you have zoning issues, you have land grants.
Well, we're not necessarily talking about...
We don't have that at a federal level.
We're not necessarily talking about corruption here. I mean, one level which the federal government does have a lot of carry in is taxation policy. There's a whole debate about taxing multinationals, most of whom would employ these big consultancy firms. Isn't that a reasonable way of looking at it?
Well, I've got to tell you that around the Parliament at the moment, I'm hearing a lot more from those who want to tax multinationals more than from the multinationals themselves. I don't think there's any lack of inertia to tax multinationals in the Parliament. I mean, I think everyone, there is a very strong political momentum around that, and I'm not sure putting red tape around consulting firms and ministers is going to help much. One of the things, though, that I thought was interesting about the Labor Party proposal is they're not mentioning the unions. I mean, if they want the consultancies to declare every time they speak to a minister, perhaps union officials who often speak to ministers, and I understand that speaking to Labor, speak to Labor ministers all the time when they're in government, perhaps it's right and appropriate they should be included. Of course, that's not part of the Labor Party proposal. I think this risks just being a whole lot more red tape for government at a time where we just have to get on and make good decisions, and the Australian public will make their judgments about whether we're making good decisions when we get to the next election. And that is how democracy works, and it's how it should work in this country.
Okay, Angus Taylor, thanks for your time today.
It's a pleasure, Chris.